Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. As you can see, it's coming to you today from a rather sunny Nottingham, so hopefully the white balance isn't sort of too cocked up by the by the sun. But anyway, it's always nice to see the sun, isn't it? Anyway, yeah. So last week, I thought last week's episode was fun. New distillery to me, it has to be said, and I'm doing exactly the same thing this week. Another new distillery to me. Although the distillery has been going since 2019. I mean, it's still relatively young at the end of the day. But basically, a few weeks ago, Giancarlo from the distillery, good Scottish name that, dropped into the shop and kindly sort of left me some samples and some information. And I thought, well, it would be rude not to do an episode of the show on the distillery. So Holyrood is yet another sort of new distillery in the lowlands of Scotland, which is always great to see. And I've probably mentioned it several times when doing episodes on the likes of Lindores and Locklear and those kind of things, to see sort of new distilleries cropping up in the lowlands. And the distillery itself was opened on Tuesday the 30th of July 2019 in Edinburgh, and that basically, I say brought to an end, but I mean there is no sort of end. But anyway, brought to an end the sort of the first phase of the distillery. I believe it was a joint development between the David Robertson, who was the ex master distiller from Macallan, and Rob and Kelly Carpenter, who were founders of the Canadian branch of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. I believe that they had the idea to sort of bring distilling back to Edinburgh in about 2013, launched a very successful, I believe, funding program, and I think they raised somewhere in the region of 5.8 million, which is actually pretty cheap, really. I mean, I was always under the impression that you don't get much of a distillery for less than 10, but anyway, so 2013 they had the idea, and in 2 years later they had a building. The building is a former railway goods shed that dates back to 1831, and then sort of after sort of a year or so of fitting things out, they basically, like I said, opened the distillery in July, with distillation starting properly in the August of 2019. Apparently the distillery complex itself is quite a nice looking building. Certainly from the pictures, it has a visitor centre, a shop, as you would expect, and apparently is located on the edge of Holyrood Park, and is sort of within spitting distance of Edinburgh and the other attractions. So they're kind of obviously hoping to sort of pick up on the tourist thing, which is really cool. Anything sort of to bring in sort of extra revenue to sort of for the distillery, I think is to be welcomed. So nice to see sort of a distillery in Edinburgh. And the interesting thing is that they again, like a lot of these sort of new distilleries, have become sort of like it's not just a question of sort of like, just using whatever barley and malting it and then producing whatever spirit. I mean, they've put some serious time and thought and into what they're planning to do, and I don't know whether the information is readily available. Certainly it was given to me that they use a number of different barley strains, so things like Golden Promise, Chevalier Hannah, Maris Otter and Plumage Archer. And not only that, do they use different strains of yeast as well. So they use things like apparently sherry floor, champagne yeast, a burgundy yeast, a sake yeast, and speciality malts as well. So chocolate malt, crystal malt, brown malt, Munich malt, amber malt and caramel malt. So apparently they produce a number of different new makes. So I asked Giancarlo if I could get a sample of the new make to kind of do, you know, sort of a comparison and all. He kindly gave me a sample of new make, which is at the end here, and you're probably thinking, why is that new make at the end of the tasting? That's a bit weird. Well, all will be revealed when I introduce the lineup. So not a great deal else to say apart from let's have a look at today's lineup. Today, I love this day. Okay, so we're going to kick off with a bit of gin. Now, apparently they did start producing a gin before the distillery was up and running, so I'm not quite exactly sure how that one worked, whether they had a gin still installed or and started the production that, or whether they were sort of outsourcing the gin production. But anyway, this, as far as I'm aware, is produced now in-house, and it's called the Height of Arrows gin. Now, one of the intriguing things about this is that there's only 3 botanicals. Obviously juniper is the main one, but they also use sea salt from the Isle of Skye and beeswax, which is sourced from Edinburgh itself. So yeah, I must admit, I think that a lot of gins have become overly complex, too many botanicals. Certainly a lot of botanicals that seem to be sort of a little bit there, well, there maybe because of they're a little bit weird and wonderful rather than flavours being added. So it's nice to sort of like, and hopefully it tastes pretty good, but we'll find out in a minute, to sort of see a kind of a stripped back classical-ish sort of gin. So that will be interesting to start with. Then we're going to move on to the first of their 2 single malts. So this is called Ambir. I hope I pronounced that correctly, and is bottled at 49.8%. So considering that distillation started 2019, we're looking at a spirit that's possibly, well, obviously no older than 5, so between sort of 3 and 5 years old. This is one of their speciality malts, so it's primarily Scottish pot still malt. 81.7% is Scottish pot still malt. They use distillers, brewers and 0.5% Levine wine yeast. It's aged in first fill bourbon, 80.7%. I mean, talk about geek central here. I mean, yeah, everything to these, you know, the nth decimal point here, which is cool. I mean, I love the fact that the distillery are giving you pretty much all the information. There's no smoke and mirrors or anything like that. And anyway, so yeah, 80.7% first fill bourbon and 10.3% Oloroso, like I said, bottled at 49.8%. Second bottling is called Embra, and this is bottled at 43.6%. Again, specialty malts, including 55.9% heavily peated malt. The yeasts they use are distillers, brewers and 0.5% passion fruit wine yeast and 0.3% Granzin wine yeast. Wow. I mean, I mean, incredible stuff, it has to be said. I mean, and one hopes that this is is going to taste good, considering all the, like I said, all the interesting effort that's gone into it. Aged 86% in first fill bourbon, 12% in peated quarter casks, and 2% in New American oak. Next bottling we'll be looking at is called the Elizabeth Yard Blended Rum Sherry Cask Edition. Bit of a mouthful. Bottled at 42.5%. Now, the rum is not actually made at the distillery. This features a blend of rums from Guyana, Vietnam, I had a Vietnamese rum, and the Philippines. It's aged in virgin American oak octave and casks and Oloroso. Don't know whether the Oloroso casks are octaves or not. And then finished in Paolo Cortado casks. So, like I said, the sherry edition. Well, we'll see. And finally, one of the new makes. And like I said, you're probably wondering why the new make is coming at the end when it really should be at the beginning. And that is because this was specifically made for the World Whisky Day of 2023. And it is called Mexico New Make Spirit, and 60%. Golden Promise barley, Vienna malt, and Mexican lager yeast. Interesting, and there is a bloody good reason why it's at the end of the tasting, which we'll obviously get to at the end of the tasting. So anyway, that's today's lineup. Let's start off with a little bit of gin.
I love your eyes, I love your lips.
Right, okay, so let's kick off with the Height of Arrows gin. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end. Nice nose, uncluttered, fresh, herbal juniper, a little bit of bitter juniper as well. Now, there's in their sort of blurb, they said that the beeswax and the salt are quite subtle and more enhancers, shall we say, and they're right, but you get quite a fair amount of salt in actual fact. That does come through quite strongly, and it's got a sort of a weight to it. You can just about pick out the beeswax just subtly beneath the juniper, but what I love about this gin is the fact it's very uncluttered, it's very crisp, it's very juniper. There's a sort of, I mean, there's a sort of almost cardamom kind of note coming through, that sort of slightly bitter green sort of note. Obviously there's no cardamom in there, but that's the kind of interesting sort of aroma that's kind of coming out as well. Almost some citrus notes as well. Again, this is like, it's really quite complex for not having very much in the way of botanicals in there. Maybe it's kind of, you know, my brain sort of fooling me, thinking there's a little bit of citrus in there, but it's possibly the freshness more than anything else. Anyway, let's see what the pass on. Palate is a bit more fuller, and I can definitely taste the beeswax. It's got that slightly waxy oiliness, but the alcohol is perfectly balancing that. Lovely mouthfeel. Again, herbal, juniper, a little bit of juniper wood as well, kind of coming through. It's got that real lovely juniper intensity, and I think, like I said, some gin producers have kind of lost sight of that fact, and the amount of gins that now seem to be sort of more about the other flavours than the juniper is kind of quite surprising. Nice length. The saltiness is coming through right on the finish. I'm getting that sort of sea salt notes on the finish, and again there's a sort of a cardamom kind of feel, and possibly almost some black pepper right on the finish. So interesting how these other flavours appear to be there but are not actually botanicals at all. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good gin. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two single malts. So this is the Ambir. Let's see what the nose gives on this. Quite youthful, cereally. I get a sort of a sour wine note, malt biscuits, a little bit of sweet barley, definitely some toffee, some vanilla, a little bit of dried fruit, not too much. Oloroso is just there, balancing, adding a little bit of dried fruit. It's very much of a kind of, I would say, a throwback lowland style. It reminds me again of the sort of more traditional lowland style, the sort of Bladnocky kind of style, the more barley centric kind of style, as opposed to the more modern style of lowland whiskey. I like this. I think this is a lovely nose. It's really nicely balanced. It's young, yes, but not too young, and it's got some lovely complexity. All the elements are sort of harmoniously blending together. The different types of yeast are obviously adding their notes. The two oak types, the barley. Yeah, I think that's really impressive. Let's see what the pal's like. Again, Opens up with that lovely cereal character. A little bit of youthful herbal spirit coming through. Some grippiness on the finish. Love that the alcohol is giving it that incredible intensity. A little bit of white fruit, barley. There's a little bit of bubble gumminess on the mid palate. Some sour red fruit, vanilla, a little bit of dried fruit. Not so much of the sherry notes kind of coming through. It's very American oak centered, and again it's allowing all that sort of lovely barley character to sort of like show. Don't think it really needs any water at all, even though it's almost edging 50%. That's showing how well the alcohol is contained within the spirit. But I am going to put a little drop of water just to see what happens. Okay, so I've lost some of that sort of slightly sour fruit notes, and it's kind of emphasising more, if it can emphasise more, the cereal, barley, classical lowland style nose. Let's still pass on that. Again, softer, showing more of the American oak. Virtually no sherry influence now. A little bit more creaminess. Touch of oak bitterness as well on the finish, a little bit of spice as well. I mean, that's a lovely palate. I mean, that is really, really good. Like I said, it feels more in the sort of style of kind of Bladnoch, Annandale, that kind of sort of more traditional style of lowland spirit, as opposed to the sort of the more estery, fruity styles that's being created. Things like I said, like Lindors and Lockley and what have you. So, yeah. Really enjoyable. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Embra. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Quite peated, you know, slight understatement there. It's got that lovely astringent peatiness, quite sort of ashy and astringent, citric. There's a little bit of medicinal notes coming, I would guess, from the quarter casks. I would imagine they're from the usual distillery that tends to use a lot of quarter casks. Bit of green pepper, white fruit, ozone, a little bit of barley. I mean, it's more about the peat, but again, I don't think the balance is too bad, to be honest with you. There's a nice freshness there, there's a nice oakiness there as well. I think with the peat being more noticeable, it is kind of lessening some of the complexity from the other malts possibly, although the two sort of, you know, wine malts were only what 0.5 and 0.3% malts, yeast, sorry. So overall, again, yeah, I like the nose. I think I prefer the unpeated because there's more distillery character there, shall we say. But you know, I think this certainly fits the bill for a peated malt. So let's pass on. Not as much peat as you would expect, given that nose being quite sort of focused on the peat. It opens up with some lovely white fruits, not estery, more sort of pear, apple, pure sort of white fruits, barley. The dry peat kind of comes through on the mid palate, a little bit of medicinal notes as well, touch of spice, touch of wood, tannin on the finish. Again, it's got a nice youthfulness. There's a cereal character that runs through it. And alright, it's not 46%, it's 43%. I think it works. I think there's enough intensity there. I mean, maybe, I mean, you know, I wouldn't say it's certainly, I don't think it's cask strength, obviously, 49.8. But maybe 46%, possibly. I'm not. I still think it's a good malt. It's still a good whiskey. and maybe 46% would be a little bit too intense. I don't know. It certainly has the intensity. It's certainly a good whisky at the end of the day. Doesn't need to be diluted at all. So yeah, good stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Elizabeth Yard Blended Rum Sherry Cask Edition. Well, definitely get some agricole notes coming straight off the bat at me. That sort of herbal agricole. There's a bit of a confected sweetness beneath. It's kind of a combination of confected sherry and rumminess, you know, caramel, sweet American oak, a lot of sweet American oak, a lot of toffee, and it's kind of, it's interesting in that, yeah, it's trying to be a sort of a crowd pleasing nose, but adding an agricole edge to it. It's just very sweet, and it's kind of, it makes me feel that one of these rums possibly has been sweetened post distillation, because it really is quite confected. There's a little bit of earth, some potpourri notes. I mean, I have no problem with sweetening rums post distillation. I mean, you know, I've got absolutely no problem with the likes of sort of Diplomatico doing that. That's the style that they want to create. Fine, no problem. And considering sort of how popular that particular range of rums is, then it kind of obviously sort of goes to show that a lot of English rum drinkers prefer it sweet. So I can see why they've done this. For me, it's just kind of not really floating my boat, but it's well crafted, and I can see exactly what they're trying to achieve by this. Let's see what the pass on. Pretty much as the nose. It's got, kind of opens up with that slightly sort of herbal agricole notes, and then in comes the slightly confected sherry and sort of treacle and sort of sugar, brown sugar. There's a bit of an astringency on the finish. There's a little bit of sort of saltiness, sort of salty, almost salty spice notes. It's a bit short, 42.5, maybe it would have been a bit more intensity, higher ABV, but I'm just not really sort of loving that slightly confected character. Again, I can see what they're playing at. I can see what they're trying to achieve, that they obviously want people, that they're aiming for people that like that sweeter rum kind of style, but by adding a little bit of an agricole rum, probably the Guyanese, I would have thought maybe, that Guyana tends to have that sort of slightly herbally kind of almost sub-agricole kind of character, probably from Diamond, I would imagine, and I think sort of Diamond use sugarcane as well as molasses. So yeah, I can see where they're coming from. As an exercise in blending rums, I think it works really well. Not entirely to my kind of taste, it has to be said, but I think that's yeah, not too shabby, as I say. Right, okay, so on to the final sample of the day. This is the Mexico New Make Spirit. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Oh, yeah, wow. I mean, that smells like a smoky mezcal, pulped agave, white fruit. There's a little bit of kind of almost kind of white wine vinegar. Wow. I mean, that just goes to show you how much influence the Mexican lager yeast has had on this. I mean, it's just amazing. It really is. And I know that sort of, I think Bill Lumsden has been playing around with yeasts and things like that. But it does seem to be a slightly overlooked factor in whisky production, which I think now is being sort of looked into a little bit more, because I mean obviously everybody's looked into the sort of the different types of barley. They've done the terroir thing, they've done the oak thing, they've done all of that, and you know, yeast was generally speaking seen as just a sort of like, you know, part of the cog. You know, it's basically there to sort of, you know, create the to do the fermentation with, and it's just kind of a bit of a vehicle. But a lot of distilleries are now looking at these different types of yeast and realising that they actually have quite a big influence on the final spirit. And it's very clean in actual fact. I'm not getting a lot of off the stilly kind of notes. Again, I don't know how well this would have taken oak. I don't think this is actually available anymore, but it's just mind-blowing, it has to be said. And I don't know what other interesting stuff they've kind of got up their sleeves. Like I said, I think they do a number of different new makes. They use sort of like the different malts, the chocolate malt and all that kind of sort of stuff. Yeah, I like that. I mean, it is a dead ringer for a mezcal, it has to be said. Yeah, there's no agave that's got anywhere near this, which is just like, just blowing my mind completely, it has to be said. Let's see what the pass line. That tastes like a 60%, not much of a finish there. It's fuller, it's more meatier, rounder. I mean, again, it's got that sort of agave kind of pulp fruit, that herbal fruit. It's got a bitterness to it as well. I mean, wow, that's got an intensity, it has to be said. Yeah, that's got a bitterness there. It's an intense and lovely bitterness, it has to be said. It's like a mezcal, it has to be said. Yet there's no agave has been anywhere near that whatsoever. Don't know what that kind of tells you about sort of the importance of the yeast, but yeah, it's just a dead ringer for an agave spirit, it has to be said. Anyway, let's see what a little bit of water does. Yeah, okay, so we're more heavier, we're more oilier now, we're more off the still notes. Again, it has that, the agave kind of character is lessened to a certain extent, and it's got more of a kind of a more barleyed character, a bit more sort of classical new make, I suppose. So the last one. I can see why they've won awards for their new make. Again, like the nose now, it's less about that sort of agave kind of character and more about the barley. There's a little bit more off the still oiliness. It's got a real spiciness, almost pepperiness on the finish now, which is really impressive. But I mean, that's obviously the alcohol that's sort of tingling my tongue that's giving the impression of a spice. Yeah, that is really impressive. That is incredible, it has to be said. So left field, just, you know, you just do not expect that whatsoever. And I think this is obviously the really intriguing thing about the distillery, is all these different sort of components that they're playing with. I mean, you know, I've often said that rum is possibly the most sort of intriguing spirit on the face of the planet, because of the different sort of raw materials and things like that can be used at different stills and so on and so forth. But this is just going to show that, you know, whiskey can just be as much as complex and as intriguing, given the broadness and all the different varieties of barley and yeast and so on and so forth that can be used. So yeah, that's just blown my mind completely, it has to be said. Wow. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. But firstly, a big thank you to Giancarlo for leaving me the samples for today's episode of the show, and nice big generous samples they were as well, so that was really cool. And you know what, I've not heard of the distillery, and I imagine there's probably a number of you have probably never heard of the distillery. Hopefully you will now, because I would seriously look them up. I love the gin. I love the sort of the purity of the gin. You know, I'm a purist with regards to whiskey, and I'm a purist with regards to my other spirits as well. And sometimes, like I said, I think some of these gins have now become overly complicated, overly cluttered, and it's just lovely to get back to a stripped down, lovely juniper-led spirit, and that I thought was really, really good. The star for me, I think, was definitely the Ambir. I mean, this is obviously the style of the spirit that they want to produce. It's basically the signature of the distillery, and it's got that lovely kind of throwback kind of lowland style. And I don't think it's too expensive. I think it's going to hit the shelves at sort of 50s, I think, and I really rate that. I think it's in line with sort of pretty much all of the other sort of relatively new distilleries, price wise, and I think that is absolutely fantastic. I love that. I think that's great. The peated malt, I mean, I love my peated malts. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, they were a bit of a love-hate thing, as you well know. Less about the sort of like the distillery character, more about the peat, although, you know, on the palate, not so much peat character. It was kind of more sort of sitting in the background, and it was a bit of a kind of like, ooh, that's a bit of a surprise. And again, you know, I thought that was a really good whiskey, and testament to, you know, the guys at the distillery. The rum, the Elizabeth Yard rum, not my thing, it has to be said at the end of the day. I can see what they're doing, I can see the market they're aiming for, and, you know, it's well crafted, well blended, it doesn't really kind of do it for me, if you like, but I think it's a really quality product. And the Mexico new make, well, that just blew my mind completely. I mean, that was just, I was not expecting that whatsoever, and it just, to me, it just goes to show how important yeast is. You know, I mean, it's just kind of like yeast is yeast as far as I was always concerned, you know, but I'm not a distiller at the end of the day, and it's just going to show that sort of, and I've said it numerous times, at every stage in the process of making whiskey adds a flavour, and you build upon that, and, you know, you don't shove it into bloody first fill sherry casks at the end of the day. You spend all this time and energy making a wonderful new make, layering your complexity, just to basically crush it under the hobnail boot of a bleeding sherry cask, as far as I'm concerned. I just don't get it. It just is just a complete waste of time, in my personal opinion. But kind of coming back to the Ambir, it's a nice blend. It's 80% odd American oak, 20% odd sherry, just balanced, works. That is how you use sherry casks. You don't stamp all over your spirit with sherry or any other oak, as yeah, Madeira is a classic example. You know, you just sort of, I mean, I was tasting a sample yesterday, in actual fact, a Tiernish finished in a first fill, I think it was a Madeira Octave, I think, and I just looked at that and I thought, on paper, yeah, no distillery character whatsoever. And it's literally, I didn't even need to taste it before I could write the tasting note. And you know, that just doesn't interest me at all. It's the complexity and the balance that really sort of gets my juices going. And so, you know, check out the Ambir, because that was bloody good. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. No idea what I'm going to be doing next week. Oh, I do know actually what I'm going to be doing. Well, hopefully I know what I'm going to be doing next week, as long as I can find the images. And it's going to be interesting. Well, it's always interesting. Every episode of the show is interesting, isn't it? Anyway, until then, good afternoon and good ramming.